The government of Alberta challenged the Impact Assessment Act in the Supreme Court of Canada a couple of weeks ago. Now, the court found the act unconstitutional in large part. Now, it appears as though the Ontario government is taking steps to push back against the feds on this. Now, to chat about this in more detail is political reporter and Sun columnist Brian Lilley, who joins us once again from Toronto. Brian, why would Ontario be interested in the so-called No More Pipeline bill in Ontario?
Well, that's what it was dubbed, the No More Pipeline bill. But really, it was as we've discussed before in a little detail, this was the federal government is in charge of everything act, really. I mean, the Impact Assessment Act went far beyond how the Constitution envisioned the provinces and the federal government interacting. To give you an example, sure, it would impact pipelines being built. It would impact whether oil sands projects could go ahead. But it was also being used to deal with mines in British Columbia. It was being used to try and push back against Saskatchewan building a baseload power natural gas electricity generator to go with their wind and solar projects. And you need that natural gas baseload power for when the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing. And they were using it against a highway here in Ontario, against housing projects. The federal government was using this in a very political way to go after projects that they didn't like from a political standpoint. The Supreme Court looked at the abuse of power, but abuse in terms of overreaching, and said that it's largely unconstitutional. But Alberta only brought a reference case. Every province and territory supported the government of Alberta in the reference case. But what Ontario is going to do now is take that reference case to a federal court and ask that it be enforced. They want to try and essentially have the law struck down because there's a number of projects that they want certainty on going ahead. One of them is a highway project. There's no way under the Constitution that the federal government should be dictating the path of a highway inside a specific province, but the federal government wants to. There's no way they should be dictating where homes are being built. But that's what they want to do. They want to use this law to get into things they shouldn't. So that's what the Ontario government under Premier Doug Ford is going to do. Ask a federal court to essentially put teeth on this reference case ruling.
Brian, the Bank of Canada is announcing their decision on another potential interest rate hike on Wednesday. That's leaving many Canadians with a very uneasy feeling. Any hint which way it could go? Could we see another rate hike?
I've been looking at the business press that covers this specifically, and you can look at the Wall Street Journal or Reuters and Bloomberg, and there's some that think they're going to stand pat. Others say, well, wage growth is going up, so inflation's going down, but wage growth is going up higher, and so this is a problem, and the bank's in a bit of a pickle. I'm hoping they stand put. We simply can't afford more rate increases. Was speaking with the food professor, Sylvain Charlebois, a little while ago. He told me that the choices that people are making about their grocery carts aren't driven as much by food inflation, which is a problem, and he's been quite vocal on that. But he said it's as much or more driven by the higher interest rates and how that affects mortgages, how it affects your line of credit payment, how it affects your rent payment because it's hitting the rental market. All of these things are coming together and hurting Canadians. A restaurant owner I was speaking to told me that his business, which has been pretty steady, has been up and down because of the rate hikes recently. People have less disposable income. So it's hurting businesses, it's hurting consumers, it's hurting families. And I think the Bank of Canada has to take that into account.
It's also hurting businesses quite a bit is the carbon tax. You talk to a lot of business owners, and it's been nasty. Brian, last month, 3 different premiers from British Columbia, Ontario, and Newfoundland wrote and asked the Bank of Canada not to increase the rates because, like you said, they've been struggling. We have since learned that the Bank of Canada Governor, Tiff Macklem, didn't like that and sent a warning letter back. Did we know what was in that letter?
He was basically saying to them that, hey, if you speak out, the independence of the Bank of Canada will be called into question. Well, the Bank of Canada has a specific mandate. It's to keep inflation low. But that doesn't mean that politicians can't speak out on it. There is supposed to be independence from the people that have actual power over the Bank of Canada, and those would be federal politicians. But I don't see a problem with a provincial premier saying, look, your policies are hurting people. Tiff Macklem lives in an ivory tower. He really does. He was a business professor here in Toronto before being appointed the head of the Bank of Canada. He lived in a very charming neighborhood with expensive homes where he opposed a daycare center because he didn't want extra traffic in his neighborhood. He's out of touch with the average ordinary Canadian. And so if a premier has to remind him now and again, look, the decisions you make hurt everyday people, and here's how, then so be it. And, this was not a partisan thing. The Premier of British Columbia is a New Democrat. The Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador is a Liberal. And the Premier of Ontario was a Progressive Conservative. So this was not a right-wing attack on him. It wasn't a left-wing attack. This was premiers from 3 different parties coming together and saying the same thing. Your policies are hurting people. Consider that before you make another move.
Brian, we're approaching the deadline for Canada changing its medical assistance and dying regulations to include mental health as a reason to seek assistance in ending your life. Now, you've recently written that this will include things like anorexia and drug addiction?
Yeah, I think when most people think, well, they're adding mental health, that it means, for depression, for severe anxiety or things like that. Anything that is considered mental health will now be wide open. And activists on various fronts are cheering this. Reuters recently did a profile of a woman who, she's 47. She says, I'm fed up dealing with anorexia. I can't wait for them to change the law so I can end my life with the help of a doctor. Doctors who were at a conference last week on drug addiction in Victoria were talking about this openly. I think many are actually horrified, but others are saying, oh, this is good news that this is coming in. I don't think we've thought this through. And when you look at the polling, it shows that a vast majority of people do not support this. Canadians have a fairly strong support for medical assistance in dying, but they want it captured. They want it regulated within certain bodies. And we were all sold on this idea. I've never been a fan of it, but the advocates said, well, it's for people who are going to die soon anyway, to put them out of their pain sooner. This is a compassionate way to deal with things. That was their argument. And since then, we've been taking guardrail after guardrail off. Now your death doesn't have to be imminent. That was due to a court challenge, and the federal government put that in there. Now they're going to bring in mental health. Well, if you've got anorexia, what about treatment? If you've got a drug addiction, what about treatment? Instead, just as we did recently until there was an outcry with our veterans who were suffering from PTSD, the answer is, have you thought about medical assistance in dying? This is a horrific way to go, and I think most people would be mortified at this.
Last week, Liberal and NDP MPs joined forces to block CBC executives being asked why they won't call Hamas a terrorist organization. Now, this week, they both voted to end a committee meeting that was called to question the RCMP commissioner on why the Mounties ended the investigation into the Prime Minister and SNC-Lavalin. Brian, what happened?
The Conservatives are calling it the cover-up coalition. The Conservative chair of the committee, John Broussard, issued a notice of meeting and had invited the head of the RCMP, Mike Duhaime, he's the new commissioner, to step forward and testify. Mr. Duhaime was there. Commissioner Duhaime showed up ready to answer questions. Mr. Broussard opened the meeting, and then immediately before they could even get to Commissioner Duhaime as a witness, before anyone could ask any questions, Liberal MP Mona Fortier moved a motion to adjourn. Under parliamentary protocols, if someone moves a motion to adjourn, it has to be voted on. Sometimes people will move such a motion just to delay things because they know it won't pass. In this case, the Liberals got the support of the NDP, so it passed, and the meeting was adjourned. It was shut down before they could even hear anything. I think it's horrible, and I think it's it shows you just how far the Trudeau Liberals are willing to go to stop anyone from looking into the PM's obstruction of justice. The reason the commissioner was called is because of what we talked about last week or so. Access to information documents showing that the RCMP was investigating the Prime Minister and his office on whether they obstructed justice in interfering in the SNC-Lavalin investigation and prosecution. They asked for documents, and the Prime Minister's office said no. They said, these are cabinet confidences, you can't have them. Rather than going to court and asking for the courts to order it to happen, the Mounties just said, oh, well, you won't show us the documents. I guess we're done here. And they closed the investigation. That's what Conservative MPs wanted to ask the commissioner about. The Liberals and their NDP coalition partners didn't want that out there. But expect this to come back to the committee. Whether they'll actually hear from the commissioner remains to be seen.
Brian, as for the CBC refusing to call Hamas a terrorist group, they pointed to groups like the BBC to justify their decision, but now the BBC has decided to drop the term militants after public outrage. Could the same thing happen here?
Not at this point. CBC seems to be holding to their position. There was a huge outcry because BBC refused to call Hamas a terrorist group and kept calling them militants. They have decided that what they're going to do now is say Hamas is a terrorist organization as described by the government. So they're kind of doing a bit of what CBC does. CBC will allow a government official to say Hamas is a terrorist organization, and then they'll provide all kinds of padding and context around it to soften it. But they won't call Hamas a terrorist organization themselves. It's a real shame on CBC. It is adopting the one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter mantra, which is a very shallow understanding of international politics, especially when it comes to this, and especially when we've seen the evidence we have of what Hamas did on October 7th.
You know, it appears as though the Trudeau Liberals are playing politics with the Israel-Hamas war. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau admitted his caucus is actually divided on the issue. Is this why his government took so long to admit that it wasn't Israel that bombed the hospital in Gaza about a week ago?
It is, and I think it's why they haven't been as outspoken and forthright in denouncing the real perpetrators of that bombing, which was Islamic Jihad. So the bombing happened about a week ago today, and the Prime Minister was asked about it on his way into question period. I'll give him full credit. He did not come out and explicitly say he blamed Israel. He condemned the bombing of a hospital, and I think we can all agree that's a bad thing. It is a crime, war crime, no matter who's committing it. But then his ministers kept making statements that sounded like they were blaming Israel. And he refused to accept the evidence that anyone could see by Wednesday morning when the sun came up that A, the hospital was still there, B, it was a parking lot where the bomb hit, C, there were not 500 victims. In fact, we don't know how many were killed in the bombing, but it was nowhere near 500. It may be very few. We don't know. But they refused to accept that evidence. They refused to accept what Israel put forward. They refused to accept what the Indian intelligence service, the British intelligence service, the Americans put forward, and said, well, we need to do our own investigation. 10 to 10 on a Saturday night, Bill Blair puts out a statement saying the Canadian Forces Intelligence Unit has looked at this and it wasn't Israel. They could have told him that on Wednesday. They just didn't want to talk about it on Wednesday. They didn't want to discuss it. And it's because of those divisions within the Liberal Party on which side people want to support that I think the Prime Minister, who probably wants to do the right thing and in many cases has, I'll give him credit in denouncing Hamas, he is playing walking a political tightrope and in many ways playing political games with this.
Now, Brian, you recently wrote that the polls show that Trudeau's time is up, but he's not going to leave. And the recent projections show a landslide Conservative majority. Can our Prime Minister see the writing on the wall?
Doesn't look like he can. And, I've said to you before, I really think Justin Trudeau wants to fight Pierre Poilievre, and I believe he thinks he can win. The polling numbers right now don't show that. The latest projections from 338canada.com would have the Conservatives winning about 205 seats, as many as 224 seats given recent polling, but the mid-mark is in about that 205 seats. The Liberals down around 80 seats. That would be a decimating defeat for the Trudeau Liberals if it goes down that way. Justin Trudeau at this point is going to do what he can to hold on to power until those polls change or until he doesn't have another choice. But he doesn't seem ready to take that walk in the snow or that surf in the fall waters and do the right thing and leave. And the longer he hangs on, the worse it becomes for whoever takes over as successor, whether it's before or after the next election.
Wouldn't the Conservatives want Trudeau to hang in there as long as possible?
Well, some want him to go. And when you look at the polling, the strongest, I think it was 57% of Canadians said Trudeau should go before the next election. And that was about 82% among conservative voters. And I thought, why? If he's doing that badly, wouldn't you want him in there? And wouldn't the Liberals want him to, Liberal supporters want him to go? But it was absolutely reversed. Look, never underestimate Justin Trudeau as a fighter and a campaigner. I may think he's horrible at governing, but the man knows how to run an election campaign and find just enough votes in just the right places to squeak out a victory. That's what we've seen the last two elections.
Political reporter and Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for joining us today from Toronto.
Thank you.